Joining me now for a look at all the week's political stories are three of the top journalists in the business. Errol Lewis, New York Daily News, syndicated columnist Miguel Perez, and Diana West with the Washington Times. Thank you all for joining me here. Diana, I want to start with you first in Washington. The Larry Craig scandal, is it simply salacious, a detour to talk about for the Republican Party, or does it have a broader implication for the GOP?
Well, I think that these scandals involving morality, comedy, good behavior always resonate more when they happen to Republicans. And so, yes, I think that this is one of these instances. I think that the scandal can be forgotten at some point in the future, but I think it's a big story this week.
Certainly is a big story, Miguel, and it's a story that people have been following, and each turn gets more disturbing than the last. I mean, there's something about hearing a sitting United States senator getting read his rights over a bathroom sex sting. That's just, it's really unusual.
Absolutely unusual, and but you know, it is the Republican Party that has claimed that they have the moral high ground, and definitely this hurts them. There's no way they can avoid that. Who replaces him? Probably another conservative Republican, because that is a pretty Republican state, so you know they don't have much to lose there.
I hope that the party does remember something from this scandal, which is, you know, I've never met or interviewed Larry Craig, but he's obviously a guy who's at war with himself. His values and his lifestyle and his job just didn't match up, and I certainly hope he can get that in line at some point. But really what happens is the Republican Party has got to, I think, learn from this, in the sense that they don't want to set themselves up for these kind of falls. That they, you know, you should not, even in conservative Idaho, I think, lose your job or be worried about losing your job, even a public job, because of your sexual orientation. It just shouldn't be that way. And maybe they'll take something of that with them and maybe campaign a little differently next year.
There's one other point. I think it's not so much that the Republicans claim the moral high ground. I think it's that they are hoping to urge people to reach for the moral high ground. And so in these cases, it's always disappointing when a Republican candidate fails in that. Whereas in the Democratic side, there's much more looseness on these different kinds of behavioral issues. So it doesn't really resonate.
It's interesting when you look, no matter which party, if there's a scandal, if you claim that with indignance that you are wronged, it's one thing. If you walk out with your wife and say, I'm really sorry, I made a mistake, I'm human, there seems to be more forgiveness.
Well, he didn't seem very upset at the accusation in that recording that we've all heard by now. I mean, that I would have, if he was really, really innocent and this happened to me, I would be screaming at the officer, "What do you mean? What are you accusing me of?"
And the guilty plea is he pleaded guilty to that.
And it sounded more like a bargaining session, his actual conversation shortly after the bust. And of course, he ended up blaming the whole thing on the press, which, I guess you can expect. The Idaho Statesman, he said, in the end, had driven him, I guess, crazy with some investigation of his personal behavior, which led him to accidentally plea guilty, which was a ridiculous sort of conclusion, and it really wasn't plausible. I think that what you said, though, is true. The Americans will forgive a lot. They will not forgive hypocrisy. There are lots of guys. I mean, Ed Edwards, the politician from Louisiana, ran a campaign saying "vote for the crook." saying that he was a rascal, but he was better than the other guy running, who in that time was David Duke. I mean, it's up to the voters to decide in the end, what they will or won't put up with. But I think everybody should know by now.
Dan, I'm going to give you
hypocrites.
The last word on Larry Craig, and then we're going to put him to rest for a while, because there's some really important things happening. Congress comes back next week, but you get the last word on the senator.
Well, I think that it's like a leadership question when someone seems to be not in control of himself enough so that he is actually soliciting sex in a bathroom, and that sort of does cuts across party lines.
Indeed. Let's talk a little bit about something that also cuts across party lines, and that is the preoccupation with what's happening next in Iraq. And with all of these benchmarks and all of these reports, we're going to have Congress back next week, and this is going to be front and center again. September is an important month. We know that most of the benchmarks have not been met. The GAO, an independent analysis of this is pretty negative. What does it mean?
They've met 3 out of 18 benchmarks, the Iraqi government. But what I see here that is so, it surprises me really, is that we all expected General Petraeus to come back in the middle of September and make one single report. And based on that one report, we were going to decide whether the search was working or not. Now the president has 5 or 6 reports going at once, 5 or 6 people who are going to advise him, and he can pick and choose what he needs. And he can spin this. The White House will spin this now.
Robert Gates said that you want to have a lot of different opinions because if you get a consensus, that means it's been sort of bureaucratically massaged. They wanted all these different opinions for the president.
Well, I think there'll be a lot of different opinions on how bad the failure is. There's one report saying that the problem is the Iraqi police, that they're completely unreliable and have in some cases even collaborated with insurgents and so forth. You've got another report, the GAO report, that says that most of the surge benchmarks have not been met. Then you've got Petraeus' report itself, which is going to, interestingly, bookend September 11th. Apparently, he's going to testify on September 10th and September 12th. It'll be a very highly charged, emotional situation where he goes in to add his version of why we haven't achieved what we were supposed to have achieved.
Diana, about 15 seconds before the break. Can you wrap it up for us?
Sure. I think that what I hope people look at is the faulty premise behind the whole notion of benchmarks. And what I mean by that is this was never going to be a government we could create out of the sand. And I think that the failures here just go to show that.
All right. Everyone stick with me. Diana West, Errol Lewis, Miguel Perez. We'll be right back with much more of our political roundtable. Stay with us.
I've run the marathon with my own lungs. This year, I'll be using someone else's. The transplant is tomorrow, and my first day of training will be after that. Even if it's just one step out of bed, and the next day, one more step down the hall, I'm going to make it to the finish line.
Find the confidence to face any condition at Cleveland Clinic.
You need to get 5,000 brochures to the trade show, 200 personalized letters mailed, and update the training manuals. From printing and mailing to document services, turn to PIP to turn down the stress. PIP, easing the pain of business.
All right, you're not the person you were before you had rheumatoid arthritis.
So who will you be?
I will be here. I will be strong.
Will you live with the pain and stiffness when your joints could be deteriorating? Or will you weigh the facts and do something?
I face my fears when the night is long.
The pain and joint damage are real. For many people, Humira can help stop them both.
Some people with heart failure should not take Humira. Humira can lower your ability to fight infections.
So tell your doctor right away if you've ever had tuberculosis or hepatitis B or are prone to infection, or if you get an infection. Don't start Humira if you have an infection such as an open sore or the flu.
There have been rare reports of serious and sometimes fatal infections and tuberculosis. Blood disorders, nervous system disorders, serious allergic reactions, and lymphoma have occurred.
Talk with your rheumatologist about Humira. The sooner, the better.
Not there yet, but I will be.
Impact Your World lets you take action on stories you've seen on CNN. Millions were touched by Yusuf, a burn victim in the Iraq War.
Response to his story has been really overwhelming and utterly phenomenal.
See how powerful you can be. Impact Your World. CNN's Anderson Cooper on the ground in Afghanistan, where opium pays the bill for terror.
The drug is directly funding the Taliban.
Life and death in the narco state. CNN September 8th and 9th, 8 Eastern.
Closed captioning hours provided by Unisom for sleep that naturally restores you. Choose Unisom.
I recharge when I Unisom.
Unisom is clinically proven to help you fall asleep faster and sleep longer every time. To naturally
restore.
For sleep that restores, I Unisom.
We're back now with our political panel, Errol Lewis, New York Daily News, syndicated columnist Miguel Perez, and Diana West with the Washington Times. The president, in a speech this week to the American Legion, says the surge is working in Iraq, but it needs more time. Here's some of what the president said.
I want our fellow citizens to consider what would happen if these forces of radicalism and extremism are allowed to drive us out of the Middle East. The region would be dramatically transformed in a way that could imperil the civilized world.
The president's expected to ask for a lot more money, $50 billion in additional funding for the war in Iraq. Can he fend off pressure from Congress to start an immediate troop withdrawal?
I think he can in the short term, but the long term is what he's talking about. So in the long term, I don't know that he can. And I think what would be really helpful would be if he were to think back to, say, the Reagan administration. Nobody thought Reagan was soft on anything related to foreign affairs, but when 282 Marines were killed in Lebanon, he did a withdrawal. I mean, there are times where you do a strategic withdrawal, and that's really what the discussion ought to be at this point.
In the spring, they told us to wait until the fall. In the fall, they're going to tell us to wait until the spring. In the meantime, Americans keep dying in Iraq. They say the numbers are lower, but 70-something per month is still unacceptable. One is unacceptable at this point.
Diana?
Well, I would say that Ronald Reagan's withdrawal from Lebanon that Errol's talking about actually was a strategic blunder and maybe brought along a number of these problems we're getting out of the jihadist world at this point. I think another problem is the president is hunting for forces of radicalism in the wrong place. It's not in the Iraqi parliament. We have problems in Iran. We have problems with Saudi Arabia. We have problems with Hezbollah, Syria. It's not a withdrawal that I would counsel at this point. It's a redirection against national security threats that are still in the region, but the president and his men don't seem to want to pay attention.
But the president has to stand behind his threats. He keeps saying there will be consequences, and then we don't see the consequences.
That's terrible.
He threatens the Iraqi government and he threatens Iran constantly, and nothing happens.
Terrible.
And would you agree, Diana, that in order to focus more on some of these other countries you're talking about, you would need to draw down some of the troops from Iraq?
Yes, I would. I would think they'd need to certainly withdraw from the cities, which is where you find the booby-trapped houses and the terrible battle conditions. Yes, I do agree with that. There's a big remixing of forces that needs to be done, but it has to start with a reconsideration of our strategy, which isn't happening on the Democratic side or the Republican side.
I want to get all of your thoughts on the president's sort of shrinking inner circle. Gonzalez, Rove, Tony Snow setting the date that he's going to leave, the president's spokesman. What does this mean for the rest of the president's tenure in the White House, with so many of sort of the original Texas posse now gone? Well,
I mean, it certainly means there'll be no more major domestic policy initiatives. There won't be another attempt to reform Social Security or anything like that. They'll be lucky if they can get No Child Left Behind reauthorized. And I think it also means that there's going to be an immense amount of burrowing in, where political cronies, second and third tier, are going to dig into federal bureaucracy so that they can survive into the next administration. It's not a small thing. I mean, it was over just such considerations, sort of political patronage, that the Gonzalez scandal broke.
Isn't this what it's always like, though, in this part of a second-term president? I mean, you've got people who have to be looking to pay for their kids for college. They've suffered the partisan, battle wounds over the past few years. I mean,
maybe, but it still reflects a lack of leadership. People are bailing out from an administration that is obviously, very unpopular at this point. So, it's the B team taking over, unfortunately.
Yeah. It's also unfortunate, given the fact that there are so many troops in battlefields around the world, that so many of these men, for different reasons, are leaving. I mean, it's difficult to continue with a B team or with a new team anyway.
Let me ask you quickly, John Warner, he announced Friday that he is not going to seek another term. You've got this scandal in Idaho. Those are two seats, I guess, that may be up for grabs. What's happening to the party in Congress?
Idaho stays Republican. There's no scenario where a Democrat could possibly win. Virginia lost a seat just in the last round, so that's going to be a hotly contested state going into 2008.
Miguel?
Good opportunity for Democrats. Warner has been more and more against the war. Democrats are against the war. It's a good opportunity in that state.
Diana, you get the very last word.
Well, I think my colleagues have said it all on that term. It'll be very interesting to see what happens with Virginia, a key state, especially looking forward to the next election.
And we didn't
presidential.
And we didn't talk about Fred Thompson.